By the time he died in 1972, Khotso Sethuntsa wasn't just a name, he was a legend. A millionaire herbalist from the Eastern Cape, 23 wives, rumored to control spirits, influence presidents, and even hold the loyalty of some of South Africa's most powerful church leaders. Some called him a witch doctor, others a businessman. The apartheid government saw him as an ally, and according to the stories, he lived with his own personal mermaid serpent, the Mamlambo, often associated with natural disasters. Today, we'll dive into the true story, exploring the politics, fortune, and secret ties linking Khotso Sethuntsa to South Africa's most powerful elite. Khotso Sethuntsa was born on the 7th of January 1898 in Haramokaketlela, tucked deep into the Fobane-Mapoteng area of Lesotho's rugged Maloti Mountains. There are some oral accounts claiming that he was actually Ndebele by heritage. These stem from his parents having migrated to the mountainous areas called Fobane-Mapoteng, being survivors in one of the most difficult periods in Southern African history, the First Matebele War that happened between 1893 and 1894. The war saw the Ndebele Kingdom under the King Lobengula having a bumpy relationship with the British South Africa Company, led by Cecil Rhodes. The Ndebele tried to avoid direct conflict, knowing European firepower was devastating to their resources and manpower, but disputes over land and resources pushed them into war, and they lost. Survivors of the war scattered. The ones who were loyal to the King Lobengula fled to the Matobo Hill region in present-day Zimbabwe. Some also sought refuge in the Chabalala area, while the others dispersed into the surrounding countryside. Khotso Sethuntsa's family vanished into the rugged wilderness, retreating to the isolated highlands of Fobane-Mapoteng in Lesotho, far from the prying eyes and the chaos of the outside world. Life here was unforgiving, thin mountain air, long winters, and a landscape that demanded resilience. Khotso himself, coming from remote, impoverished rural origins and a black inhabitant of a country under oppressive white minority rule, turned to the supernatural as a means of manipulating circumstances and attaining power and wealth which would otherwise have been beyond his reach. From a young age, he worked as a farmhand, herding cattle, tending to fields, and living off of the land. But in the early 1920s, his life took a dramatic turn. Legend has it that after being fired by a white farmer that he was working for, a sudden tornado ripped through the property, destroying only the owner's house, while leaving the rest of the farm untouched. Locals began to see him not just as a humble herbalist, but as someone with dangerous, possibly destructive powers. Immediately, the ability he had to manipulate natural forces with such precision was seen as witchcraft by the surrounding community. Fear spread quickly, and it is said that Khotso was pressured, if not outright chased, out of the Maloti Mountains. He then crossed into Kokstad. Before we continue with this deep dive, we need to acknowledge information concerning him comes primarily in the form of oral accounts, derived from interviews conducted between 1997 and 2008 in the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, and Lesotho. It was here that Khotso built his reputation not just as a healer, but as a man who could change people's fortunes. Literally, Khotso's power came from Swaziland. He was said to have undergone Uktwala, a dangerous ritual that allows you to acquire long-term wealth, often involving spiritual beings like the Mamlambo. Let's speak about Mamlambo for a second. The word Mamlambo derives from the Xhosa language for river, Mlambo. Mamlambo, her full name in Xhosa, resides in deep water. She is known as the mother of the river. The Mamlambo is a shape changer who is often said to appear in the form of bright shining objects in the water, which plays around the symbols of wealth, such as sparkling and shining coins. However, the Mamlambo is most conceived as a snake, a mermaid, or a seductive woman. She demands offerings, which can include bread or banknotes, or the blood of animals, and even the blood of those closest to the owner, such as family members. The wealth she grants comes at a terrible price. The owner of the Mamlambo is required to sustain the Uktwala with sacrifices that come from great personal and moral cost. She wreaks havoc in her partner's life, damaging or even destroying close personal relationships and undermining individual sexuality. There are multiple testimonies about these spirits. One woman from Transkei recalls saying, "She wants blood, and you must slaughter and slaughter. At some point, she will yearn for human blood." There's a passage that I read from W.D. Hamontuke that indicates that Uktwala was first practiced in KwaZulu-Natal from the earliest parts of the 20th century onwards, since Durban was one of the principal places where it could be purchased. In 1962, according to Hamantuke, the two most famous sellers of the Mamlambo resided in Kokstad and Durban. Khotso was the Kokstad man, and the man from Durban was Dr. Israel Alexander, who derived much wealth from his mail-order businesses in herbal medicine. Khotso's Uktwala clientele came particularly from the regions where he lived and worked, the Eastern Cape, Southern KwaZulu-Natal, and Lesotho. However, he also drew customers from other parts of South Africa, including present-day Gauteng. Khotso's clients came from all over Southern Africa, black and white, rich and poor. Most recently, in a series of interviews that was conducted between 2001 and 2002, various informants stated that Mamlambo could be attained from Indian or white shopkeepers in Durban or Johannesburg. Mainly, it's because of their relatively prosperous, privileged positions. Members of these groups were viewed as having more access to relatively strong magic. Many came far seeking the same thing, control over their lives, in a country where markets, politics, and poverty felt uncontrollable. He marketed herbal remedies like Ibangalala for sexual potency. And then there were the stories that he could cause tornadoes and lightning strikes at will, that he knew where Paul Kruger's lost treasure was buried. I just felt like I should add this in. There's a man who described an experience of a relative who went to Khotso for Uktwala. And he says, as they slept, he was not alone. He was with his friends because they had come for a common purpose. People had many objectives to go there, but they would group them accordingly. Now, ultimately, they realized that the room they were sleeping in was full of water, whereas it was dry before they went to sleep. But then they discovered that they were covered with water and there was a big snake in the water. They had been warned that whether you feel anything or see anything, they should not be scared. They should be brave enough. The snake started wrapping itself around them, and at the start, they enjoyed that. Then it pretended to swallow them, and they got scared and cried out. They tried to open the door and run outside, but somebody opened the door for them, and there was nothing. So they were sent away because they had failed. This description has a weirdly erotic quality to it, as the snake winds its body around the men and they find the sensation pleasurable. This sensual dimension of the Uktwala experience was also emphasized by a man from Tiatianing in Lesotho who had been through Uktwala in the 1950s and 1960s. He speaks of the pool test. He said, "The snake winds around your body, but don't panic. Mermaid, naked lady, don't act, just stand. Don't be tempted. She will give you love, kisses. Just pretend nothing is happening." Whether you believe them or not, these stories are what build his brand. They also brought him to the attention of people far more powerful than local villagers. Oral history and multiple journalistic accounts say his clientele included apartheid leaders J.G. Strydom and Hendrik Verwoerd. Some went to him for herbal medicines, others, it said, sought muti to influence political outcomes for the 1948 elections that brought the National Party to power. Beyond Strydom and Verwoerd, Khotso had connections to D.F. Malan, another key apartheid figure. It suggested he even served as the Broederbond's intelligence agent in the Transkei region. The Afrikaner Broederbond, founded in 1918, was a secret society of Afrikaner men, a powerful network of teachers, ministers, politicians, and businessmen. Its purpose was to unite Afrikaners after the Anglo-Boer War, protect Afrikaner culture, and slowly take control of South Africa's political and economic system. Members were handpicked, sworn to secrecy, and pledged to put Afrikaner nationalism above all else. By the 1940s and 1950s, the Broederbond had its people in top government, church, and business positions. In fact, many of the architects of apartheid, like Hendrik Verwoerd, were members. They made decisions behind closed doors, and those decisions filtered down into public law and policy. So, how does this connect to Khotso Sethuntsa? Here's where it gets interesting. Oral accounts and testimonies, including those collected by historian Jacob Dlamini, suggested that Khotso had dealings with high-ranking Afrikaner leaders. He openly admired Paul Kruger and embraced Afrikaner nationalist mysticism, what some called government witchcraft. Some claim Khotso's fortune and protection came from these relationships. Allegedly, he supplied muti, which is medicine and charms, to Afrikaner politicians, while in return he received land, cattle, and political shielding. In this sense, his ties weren't with the Broederbond directly as a card-carrying member, that was whites only, but rather as a trusted spiritual asset, someone they believed could bend fortune and fate to Afrikaner advantage. You could say Khotso operated parallel to the Broederbond as part of their invisible spiritual economy. They worked on the physical and political front, and he worked on the mystical front. Together, they shared a belief that destiny could be shaped by both policy and spiritual manipulation. There is also a darker thread that surfaced in this investigation. Khotso Sethuntsa's alleged connection to Hendrik Verwoerd, the so-called apartheid architect. According to whispers, Verwoerd was warned that enemies plotted his death because of the brutal land laws and oppressive policies he was enforcing, such as the 1950s Group Areas Act, the 1913 and the 1936 Land Acts, the Bantu Education Act of 1953, and the Pass Laws. Seeking protection, he was said to have traveled to Kokstad to consult Khotso Sethuntsa, the man of mysterious medicines. There, he was reportedly given muti and strict instructions said to render him untouchable by bullets. And strangely, the legend seemed to prove itself. Verwoerd survived multiple assassination attempts by gun. In April 1960, David Pratt shot him twice at close range during a parliamentary session, but the wounds were not fatal. 6 years later, in 1966, another attacker fired at him again, and yet he lived. To his followers, it looked like the man could truly not be killed by a gun. But the protection had its limits. On the 6th of September 1966, Verwoerd was assassinated inside Parliament by Dimitri Tafendas, who stabbed him repeatedly with a knife. According to inside whispers, Tafendas had been told what others did not know, that Verwoerd could never be killed by a gun, so he chose the blade. And this time, the prophecy shattered. Khotso's supposed shield failed, and Verwoerd's life ended in blood. By the mid-1960s, Khotso Sethuntsa's holdings reportedly included 9 houses and 16 farms, a staggering real estate empire. But then in 1957, apartheid-era legislation forced Khotso to leave his estate in Kokstad. He had to relocate to Lusikisiki, highlighting how even someone of his stature was not immune to the oppressive systematic policies of that time. The Self-Government Act was passed in 1951 when the Bantu Authorities Act and related self-government acts were passed to reshape land ownership for black South Africans. The idea was to push Africans into homelands or reserves, stripping them of land in white areas. Khotso Sethuntsa had built a massive empire around Lusikisiki, Kokstad, and Flagstaff, owning farms, cattle, and property. But by law, as a black man, he technically couldn't hold land in white designated zones. In the early 1960s, Khotso had bought a farm and several properties. His wealth made him exceptional, but also put a target on his back. When enforcement tightened, he was forced out, and some of his land was either confiscated or had to be transferred under white ownership. Others of his properties, like Flagstaff and Lusikisiki, suffered from similar issues that followed him in the Transkei region. While he managed to hold on to some land through loopholes and intermediaries, he was reportedly challenged by the authorities. By the late 1960s, a lot of his land empire had been reduced or absorbed into the homeland system. Now, you're probably asking, why wasn't he protected? Even though he had connections with the Afrikaner elites and possibly supplied muti to politicians, those ties had limits. The first one is the race boundary. The Broederbond and apartheid system were built to preserve white supremacy. Khotso may have been useful, but he could never be fully inside the system. When his land ownership threatened the apartheid logic of separation, the state acted. The second point is the internal policies. Some Afrikaners saw him as an ally, others as a threat. His wealth, influence, and mystical reputation made him both valuable and dangerous. The fact that people flocked to him, black and white, undermined apartheid's rigid racial hierarchy. The third one is the controlled favor. So Khotso was allowed to play big, but not too big. He could be rich, flamboyant, and even politically connected, but he was not immune to apartheid laws. When the state needed to make an example or reinforce land segregation, he was sacrificed. His home in Mount Nelson in Lusikisiki was decorated with busts of Paul Kruger statues of lions and eagles and symbols of the old South African Republic. There were statues of himself, his father, and his grandfather that were surrounded by symbols of the Afrikaner Nationalist Party. Though illiterate and speaking little English, Khotso cultivated a persona steeped in secrecy and legend. He boasted spiritual contact with Paul Kruger and claiming access to Kruger's hidden treasure, which he said funded his empire. This was out of character for Khotso, mainly because he was known as a proud African spiritual leader, a man whose power came from deep roots in traditional healing and prophecy. People expected him to stand apart from the policies and symbols of white minority rule, not embrace them. On the topic of Paul Kruger, we have on record that Khotso Sethuntsa won the Durban July 3 years in a row, 1954, 1955, and 1956. These victories became central to the mystical legend around him, with Khotso himself claiming that it was the spirit of Paul Kruger that whispered the names of the winning horses. Whether or not you believe the tales, the official race books lines up with the story. In 1954, the July was won by C.S. Sibon. The following year, in 1955, the title went to Preto's Crown. And in 1956, it was Spray Bridge that crossed the line first. For Khotso's followers, this wasn't just luck. It was proof that his spiritual power extended even into the world of the elite horse racing. So when he openly praised Paul Kruger and surrounded himself with Afrikaner nationalist imagery, it left many confused, even betrayed. To his followers, it looked like he was siding with the very system that kept them down. And by mixing Afrikaner mysticism and African spiritual practices, some felt he was using his gift to serve political power rather than the people. The same reason whispers of government witchcraft began to follow him. His friends weren't only in politics. He also worked with black leaders under the control of the National Party, such as K.D. Matanzima and Botha Sinkao. He also reportedly had ties to Sol Kisner, the founder of South Africa's largest hotel groups, Southern Sun and Sun International, who allegedly let Khotso stay in his hotels for free because he attracted wealthy clients. Khotso also claimed that his astonishing wealth came from Paul Kruger's lost treasure. Paul Kruger being the first president of the South African Republic. He would even honor Kruger by celebrating Kruger Day with lavish feasts and car shows at his compound. Fascinatingly, he said on many accounts that Paul Kruger appeared to him in his dream to guide him, even to the extent of telling him which horses to bet on in the prestigious Durban July Festival. He was seen purchasing Cadillac cars in cash annually at the local agricultural shows, always seen flaunting his wealth and status to the locals and newspapers. Moreover, it should be put to mind that Khotso's clientele came not only from economically embattled Southern African communities. A substantial number of middle-class entrepreneurs, both white and black, visited Khotso, seeking to shape the economic trends in their own lives, rather than be at mercy of market-related forces beyond their control. His fame even reached overseas, with African Americans reportedly writing to him for charms and healing rituals. And then there were the church connections. Some of the former church members claimed that figures in the Zion Christian Church, Shembe Church, and the IPCC had dealings with Khotso. Some say these leaders sought his medicines for spiritual assistance. Others suggest deeper links. If you look back at the videos we did on the ZCC and the Nazareth Baptist Church, they are both part of a network that blends African traditions and spiritual power with Christian imagery. There are whispered tales that the phrase Khotso Aebele Rona originates not just from scripture, but from the God of Khotso, said to grant power and prosperity to those who invoke in him. According to these legends, Engenas Lekganyane, the founder of ZCC, consulted with Khotso before deciding where to establish the church. At one point, he considered founding the church in Lesotho, where apostolic churches were already strong. As covered in our video on the ZCC's origin, Engenas had a fallout with Edward Motaung in Basotholand, prompting him instead to follow a divine vision, receiving medicines and directions to ascend a mountain and begin the church. After Engenas's death in 1948, tensions erupted within the ZCC. In June 1949, a democratic-style election was held where Edward Lekganyane was chosen as his father's successor by a large majority, and Joseph established the breakaway St. Engenas ZCC, symbolized by the dove. It's said that Edward again sought out Khotso, believing the Spirit had guided his father's steps to secure divine favor for his leadership. Legend holds that he was instructed to put a dark cloth around the ZCC star to symbolize and harness the spiritual darkness. This act reportedly marked a shift in the church's spiritual tone. Furthermore, in organizations like Kereke ya Sephiri, some preachers use the Bible as a facade for darker teachings. Many early ZCC members were illiterate and the Bible was barely read in church. Edward was then told to keep the Bible close and start preaching the use of the Bible to his congregation while still placing the star in darkness, ensuring both legitimacy and spiritual potency. We'll touch more on Kereke ya Sephiri in a moment. After these rituals, the church is said to have grown explosively from around 30,000 members to over 4 million under Edward's leadership, eclipsing all rivals in both influence and numbers. However, there is no concrete evidence, historical record, or even a credible account of Khotso Sethuntsa ever meeting with the founder of the ZCC. The Zion Christian Church was officially founded in 1910, and at that time, Khotso would have been only 12 years old, far too young to wield this kind of influence, these stories suggest. This timeline alone makes such claims highly unlikely and historically inaccurate, placing them more in the realm of legend than fact. Do you know about Kereke ya Sephiri, or the Church of the Secret? It's one of the lesser known stories buried in Southern African folklore, especially in the Eastern Cape and Free State. People say this secret church could awaken the dead to fight in battle. The tale goes that when Afrikaners moved north during the Great Trek in the 1830s and the 1840s, they often clashed with local tribes. But in some encounters, Afrikaner soldiers claimed they weren't just fighting men, they were fighting spirits. To prepare, Afrikaners themselves would bring missionaries to pray for their soldiers before and during battle. In response, African healers, Inyanga and Sangomas, started blending Christianity with their own practices. They'd hold the Bible, pray in the name of Jesus, but call on ancestral forces and even darker powers. Outsiders called this the dark side of Christianity, but within those communities, it was understood as spiritual warfare. Now, here's where Khotso Sethuntsa connects. Khotso wasn't alive during those frontier battles, but the underground movement of healers never disappeared. Their rituals and teachings were passed down in secret circles of Inyanga, and that's the knowledge Khotso inherited decades later. By the time he rose to power in the 20th century, he was seen as a custodian of those same traditions, a man who stood at the crossroads of Christianity and African spirituality, carrying the legacy of the so-called secret church. And if we take a look at churches like the ZCC, the Shembe, or the IPCC today, you see echoes of that same fusion. They carry the Bible, they pray in the name of Jesus, but their rituals, song, and spiritual power are deeply rooted in African traditions. To many outsiders, this looks like a contradiction, Christianity mixed with pagan practices. But in reality, it's the same syncretism that shaped Khotso's power and the same blending of spiritual worlds that still defines some of South Africa's most powerful religious movements. This is why we hear a lot about Khotso being rumored to have started or aided these churches into success. I think this is a little bit too far-fetched, but I digress. It's a familiar accusation still heard today that some churches mask traditional spirit work behind Christian symbols. So, after his death, a legal battle revealed his estate's sheer scale. Around 248,910 in property, 68,532 in cash, livestock, furniture, gold coins, and more. His son Langalase Afrika eventually inherited the estate by custom alongside testimony of his favorite wife about the succession. He would also have visitors including US tourists who would travel to see his blue and white mansion known as Mount Nelson and the base of his legendary kingdom. Some oral lore suggests that people still encounter his spirit in dreams and that rituals are still being performed at his former compound. Khotso Sethuntsa died in 1972, and even in his death, he was feared. Some say his embalmed body was kept at his compound, others refused to speak of his name. To his supporters, he was a self-made man who rose from nothing to wealth and influence in a hostile system. To his critics, he was a dangerous manipulator of spirits and people. His life is a study in power, not just the supernatural kind, but the political kind. How a man from the rural margins could become a broker between the most powerful figures in apartheid South Africa, and how myth, money, and politics can weave together into something larger than life. His fascinating life is captured in the well-researched biography, The Extraordinary Khotso Millionaire Medicine Man from Lusikisiki by Felicity Wood and Michael Lewis, which explores the intersection of magic, entrepreneurship, and South African politics during apartheid, a narrative still enmeshed in mystery and myth. And maybe that's why his story refuses to die, because in South Africa, the lines between politics, religion, and the supernatural have never been as separate as they seem. This is the Need to Know channel, and thank you.